My name is Eric Patterson, and this is the Religious Freedom Institute's 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series. At the Religious Freedom Institute, our mission is to secure religious freedom for everyone, everywhere around the world. The purpose of the 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series is to understand, in the context of the current conflict, some of the religious dimensions on the ground in the region, and in specific, some of the religious freedom dimensions in Ukraine. My guest today is author and journalist Mindy Belz. Mindy wrote World Magazine's first cover story in 1986 and went on to serve as international editor, and senior editor. She covered wars and victims of conflict in the Balkans, Sudan, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. She recounts some of those experiences in her book, They Say We Are Infidels. The book won the Gospel Coalition's 2016 award for first-time author. She's seen these factors on the ground, and she's taught journalism around the world, from India to Uganda to Hungary to the United States. Mindy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
The past decade has been a time of one refugee crisis after another. Before we look at the Ukraine crisis, are there other refugee crises that you're currently following?
Yeah, I mean, just to underscore what you're saying with a few numbers, we have more people displaced in the world than we've ever had in modern times. 84 million is the number. That means people who are registered with the UN. And, a full 27, 30 million of those are displaced outside their country. So they fit the legal definition of refugees. The most obvious crisis point right now, besides Ukraine, is Afghanistan. We all watched last summer how the speedy exodus of the United States led to this complete destabilizing of the country. And we had in just those few months, 700,000 Afghans who were forced to flee their homes for a variety of reasons. But that, as we know, is a longstanding crisis. And you have millions of Afghan refugees in Pakistan, other neighboring countries, filtering into Africa and Europe. And that will continue to be an issue that's with us. Only 76,000 of those that were displaced last year have been resettled in the United States. So just to give you a scale of the problem versus the US response, it's been pretty typical over the last few years. A couple of other places would just include Syria, long-standing situation, continue to see about half of the population of Syria unable to return to their homes. Venezuela is another one that is not on a lot of people's radar, where people were forced out into Colombia in large numbers, and that also remains unresolved. And then the Tigray region in Ethiopia. So you see how it spans multiple continents and how these rapid conflicts, the Tigray region just erupted in conflict last year and had resulted in massacres of people, some of them outside of churches inside Tigray. And that forced that fear that the fighting itself forced people to flee that region. So, I think what's new about these conflicts is that we're seeing conflicts that happen without resolution. And that's why pressing for a resolution, hopefully one that favors Ukrainians, is not only in the interest of the security of the region, but the security is dependent on having a secure population, a population that feels like they can return and rebuild, or that can resettle in ways that allow them to move on with their lives. And that's what we want to see. To really underscore the seriousness of what's happening to Ukrainians, we saw 1 million people flee Ukraine in 1 week of this conflict. And it took 2 years for the conflict in Syria to reach that sort of level. So it tells you what a massively destabilizing situation we potentially have in Ukraine.
This isn't the first time that Ukraine has had a refugee crisis. There was the Russian invasion in 2014, 2015 that resulted in a refugee flow at that time. Could you tell us, are there lessons from that refugee crisis that would inform how we think about this today?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the situations, apart from the fact that it was Russia that was sort of instigating the conflict, the situations are very different. The exodus in 2015 was because of the invasion into somewhat isolated but strategic areas, the Crimean Peninsula and the Donbass region in the east. The fighting was very different. It was more like an insurgency where you had Russia-backed militias fighting Ukraine forces and local militias there. And so it was obviously localized. What we've all seen is Russian missiles targeting apartment buildings, residential areas, and large cities that force hundreds of thousands of people to flee. They simply have no other choice. And the widespread nature of the assaults by Russia means that people are going to the borders. It's not simply that they can get out of their apartment building and be safe. They have to get out of the country. And so I fear that we have a situation where we could be looking at a failed state over time. We could be looking at a long-standing insurgency that will just make it impossible for people to ever physically be able to go home, or if they physically could, to feel enough security to go home. That's what we've seen in Iraq and Syria. And we just want to find ways to avoid that.
Yeah, you reminded me of these long burning conflicts that leave the detritus of war. I'm thinking about the Balkans, for instance, where there can be both psychologically tremendous reservation, suspicion of neighbors, landmines, cluster munitions, other exploded ordnance, the destruction of agricultural fields, the destruction of housing, the destruction of water sources, the destruction of the electrical grid, this widespread destruction that makes it almost impossible for people to go home or to want to go home or to feel like they can be safe. And in the Ukraine case, it's hard to understand what kind of security guarantees they will ever have on their eastern flank without some sort of global response guaranteeing their security.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed in the European Union, whereas many of those same countries have rejected Syrian and Afghan refugees, at least in the past. Mm-hmm. Is this a double standard?
Yeah, there's a lot that's been written about that over the last few weeks, criticizing Europe for welcoming Ukrainians so readily while not welcoming, as you say, the Syrians and the Afghans in particular. I mean, I think it's the wrong time to pick that argument. And I say that as someone who's argued for more humanitarian treatment of Syrians and Afghans. There has been too much that has depicted them as all terrorists when that simply is not the case. And yet, I think it's the wrong time to pick that argument. The Ukrainian situation sits right at Europe's borders. 4 million people who have now taken refuge in 5 neighboring countries, with some experts saying that number could go as high as 10 million. And so knowing the scale, knowing the severity of the war that the Ukrainians face, it's wonderful, I think, to see how whole cities in Poland, whole churches have turned over their property to welcoming and making room for these refugees. And what I hope might happen is that Europe's handling of this crisis can open the door to these other refugee groups. These situations aren't totally going away from us, and that we will see sort of exercising the muscle, if you will, for welcoming the stranger and seeing how they become not a burden, but a contribution to our communities. And so that's maybe optimistic. I think that over time, this is going to become a tremendous burden on some of these communities and churches and organizations that are doing incredible work right now. But I think we should be glad and we should be encouraging this kind of response.
Mindy, this is very helpful. You've given us some sense of the scale of the problem and some lessons to be learned. Is there anything that we've missed?
Well, I think the obvious question that everyone has is, what does it mean for us in America? And, we may on any given day feel that the crisis in Ukraine is far away, that the war won't make its way to our doorstep. But over what I've seen over the years is that one way or the other, it will in different ways. And I think that we should be looking for opportunities. I think particularly with these refugees, my own small town in North Carolina, population of about 100,000, we have a large Ukrainian community that's been here since the 1990s, and they fix our cars. They're plumbers. They own construction companies. They have fabulous churches that we enjoy visiting and doing things with. And we already know that we're likely to receive about 50 Ukrainians from an orphanage outside of Kyiv. And it's wonderful to think of ways that we can come around this Ukrainian community here to help them serve these people who will be coming. And I think that all of us, we need to be looking for these opportunities, not just waiting for them to show up, because I've seen over and over again how these opportunities are blessings. They're not burdens over the long term. They end up being people who contribute to our communities, or who may be stabilized in a way that allows them at some point to return to their home country.
That's a great admonition for all of us, to always think about other people as blessings and not as burdens in our lives, right? So, Mindy Belz, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.